I'm Terry Kogan. I'm a professor at the College of Law and one of the organizers of this conference. We want to welcome you to the 4th annual Tanner Conference on Human Rights, Conflict Resolution, Nonviolence, and Peace. And as you all know, the subject of this year's conference is controlling sexuality through violence, shame, and cultural oppression. Before we turn over to our speaker, I want to remind everyone that this afternoon there will be another session at the Officers Club, where many of us just came from, which begins at 2:30 to 4:30, and the topic of this panel, of the next panel, will be Breaking the Cycle, Prevention in the Next Generation. It will be moderated by Don Strasberg of the Psychology Department, and our three distinguished panelists will be Rose Ellen Epstein from the Utah Pride Center, David Hebner from the University of Utah Psychology Department, and Margaret Rosario from the City University of New York. So we invite all of you, after the keynote, to come back for the second panel today, and then we begin once again with the third panel tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. To introduce our keynote speaker, we have the university's own Catherine Stockton, who is chair of the Gender Studies Department and a member of the English Department, and has been a stalwart, committed member of the planning committee for this conference. So I turn it over to Catherine Stockton.
Thanks, Terry. You can hear me all right, I trust? If you mix Lady Gaga and Meryl Streep, remove the more spectacular costumes of the first and the perfectly rendered Julia Child's accent of the second, while keeping the brio of Mamma Mia wed to Streep's obvious intellect. If you mixed a village voice with that of philosopher Jacques Derrida and rock and roller Patti Smith, and added a touch of Virginia Southern cracker, just the kind that undermines Ivy League pretense. If you sought someone who could speak with equal aplomb about neoliberal corporate chumminess and journalistic renderings of lesbian homicide with a side order of feminist sex wars, well then, to my mind, you'd have Lisa Dugan, formerly of Brown University and now professor of social and cultural analysis at NYU, who recently penned for The Nation magazine an article entitled, "What's Right with Utah?" Never have the bold and the beautiful come together in just this way, in such a nationally prominent voice inside queer theory and feminist theory, one that is committed to the activist edges of radical thought, leading to, among her many famous publications, The End of Marriage, her forthcoming book, The Twilight of Equality, and my favorite, Sapphic Slashers. Just like Visa, Lisa Dugan is everywhere you want to be. And if you find this introduction overblown, campy, and a George Bataille-style potlatch of expression, a vision of excess, if you will, one that could only come from the mouth of someone who finds Jane Austen as perverse as Jean Genet, I say, oh well, I can't be objective when it comes to Lisa Dugan. She's done so much to confirm the queerest thing about me, and perhaps about you, our inexplicable attraction to Utah. Please help me welcome Lisa Dugan.
I want that introduction everywhere I go. Wow. Well, the organizers wanted me to ask before I get started, how many of you heard about this event on Facebook? Yeah, okay. So much for the social media. And hell, old-fashioned publicity apparently also works. So I want to thank Catherine Stockton for inviting me to this conference, to the Tanner Center for sponsoring it, to all of the organizations and the planning committee who've worked so hard to put it together. It's an enormous pleasure of mine to be here, both to engage in these conversations and because I have a perverse love of Utah and any excuse I can find to come here. So first, I wanted to ask you all, how many of you were at Shannon Mentor's keynote last night? Okay, and how many were not? About half and half. Okay, so I'll start out by just giving a brief description to say that last night Shannon Mentor offered us a powerful evocation and analysis of the damage done to LGBT people by the denial of the right to marry. Damage that extends well beyond the denial of the concrete benefits, but to denial of inclusion also in the web of kinship relations that provide both emotional and material security for so many people. And there's simply no denying the gravity of that damage. There's no way not to recognize it as invidious discrimination at odds with any substantive ideal of democratic life. So I wanted to thank Shannon for outlining that reality in such a compelling and moving way. I do want today, in the second keynote, to shift the ground of our discussion a bit, acknowledging to begin with that the institutions that we live and work within really shape the way we see the world. So Shannon is a lawyer who focuses on expanding democracy in the United States through the process of law reform. Our panel earlier in the day included various social scientists and clinicians who work in the present with LGBT populations to try to advance the welfare and expose the difficulties and discrimination that attend those populations. I happen to be trained in history with a specialization in gender and sexuality studies. So, of course, I want to start out by providing a kind of big historical frame for thinking about LGBT lives and politics, to thinking about the histories of violence and discrimination and about the formulation of political aspirations in relation to those. So I'm going to take what may seem to you, while I'm doing it, to be a little bit of a digression, to give a kind of big historical framework. But it'll be, did any of you ever watch Saturday Night Live when Father Guido Sarducci was on? Does anyone remember the 5-Minute University? One of my favorite sketches. It's like in 5 minutes you can learn everything you need to know about economics, supply and demand, Spanish, como está usted? It's everything you'll remember 5 years after you graduate. So this is basically several centuries historical frame in 5 minutes, and then we'll get to the freak flags and freedom fighters that are in the title to the talk. So in the first instance, I just want to bring to our attention the fact that the idea that there is a distinct minority population of homosexuals amidst a culturally and historically dominant population of heterosexuals, that idea is culturally and historically specific. It occurs in Europe, it arises in Europe and the United States in the late 19th century. And it doesn't really come to be the dominant framework within how we think about the categorization of gender and sexuality until after World War II, when it really instantiates itself as really the dominant frame. The naming of bisexual, intersex, transsexual, and transgender identities come even later in the 20th century. The organization of these identities in the 20th century and into the 21st centuries, even the emergence of these notions, the categories we have of lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender, and heterosexual, are actually, even in the present, unevenly distributed and shared. There are populations within the United States that don't understand their sexual dissonance or their sexual conformities or their sexual categories in those terms. As well as different times and places, and even where we stand now, there's an uneven distribution of what are the dominant terms of understanding. Historians and anthropologists always love pointing out times and places where the organization of gender and sexuality was very different. Take, for instance, Greek pederasty, one of the favorite counterexamples, where all elite adult men had sexual relations or were expected or was considered normal to have sexual relations with younger men, men of lower status, and women. Or another favorite of anthropologists, the Trobriand Islanders, where all young men go through a ritual fellatio as part of their socialization into manhood. There are many examples of ways of thinking about gender and sexual variance and that use different category systems, different ideas than the ones that are dominant now. And in this history, there has been also a very wide range of ways that that sexuality and gender has been regulated. Oh, my water. I didn't see it get put there. So there are different institutions, different institutionalizations, and different ways of regulating gender and sexuality. The institution of Christian marriage has a particularly complicated historical relation to the European nation states and the founding of the United States. In North America, Europeans in settling in North America not only took the land of indigenous people and imported African slaves to work on it, but they also imposed of their own version of Christian marriage on native peoples who had other customs, other ways of relating, while they withheld it from African slaves and prevented African slaves from participating in marriage in order to maximize their control. So the question then is why? How did marriage and the institution of marriage go hand in hand with the form of domination that Europeans established in North America? And this is a commonplace argument among feminist and queer historians and anthropologists, and that is that the marital household, the household founded on Christian marriage historically, was the primary way of organizing property relations, of transmitting property through legitimated reproduction, of awarding and withholding citizenship rights, of awarding the right to own, of distributing forms of labor, of regulating reproduction in general, and of fitting the everyday lives of people into the forms of economics and politics that were the dominant European form, and then ultimately in the United States, the English form that was established here. The kind of household that we think of now or take for granted in the present, one man, one woman, and their children, among whom there's an economic unit that's also a reproductive unit that's charged to share resources and for the care of dependents, that unity is an economic and political unity that has a very specific political history. There's nothing natural or ahistorical about it. It appears at a time and place in relation to a particular kind of polity. And the history of this is something feminist historians have written about for a long time. I hope maybe we have a few in this audience, of tying the institution, the history of tying this institution of marriage to the ideology of romantic love has been a long and kind of rocky one. And that was a long process because originally romantic love was associated almost exclusively in Europe with adultery, and certainly not with marriage. That romantic love was something that existed as in adultery, but no one expected it to exist within marriage. And it really wasn't fully until the 20th century And there was a fuller separation of the household and the workplace spatially, that something emerges like the companionate family that's understood in some way to be bonded by personal emotion and not solely by economic necessity. But as feminists have argued now for the past 30 years, this companionate marriage and the ideology of romantic love in part obscures the economic and political formations that are at stake in the regulation of marriage and reproduction. So that's the sort of overview that I want to speak within and come back into. I want to focus on two historical moments now, and then use them to then think, sort of maybe take a little can opener to our thinking about the present. And one is, the first one that I want to focus on is the Stonewall era, which, you know, I'm old enough to have lived through, and was quite a while before most of you were born. It's a kind of, you know, mythologized origin of gay liberation. It's not, in fact, as research by people like Susan Stryker and others have shown, it was not the only riot against the police. It wasn't the first one. It's the one that got mythologized. And that it appeared out of that, though, and around that time period, not only from this mythologized riot, new forms of political thinking and new forms of political organizing appeared that were rejections of, critiques of the earlier form of the homophile movement. So the homophile movement in the 50s, which itself was really a tiny movement that took incredible risks and made courageous stands, but in a period when the persecution of homosexuals and perverts was tied up also in the anti-communist witch hunts, which pulled persecutions of gay people into that as well. The homophile movement made what was a unique argument, and they argued that there was a homosexual minority, that there was a minority of people who were homosexual, and that minority of people deserved equal rights. And that was a really groundbreaking formulation that certainly there were little shreds that they were drawing on from previous decades and centuries, but this was a novel moment to really make that claim and have it be heard and circulated. But the Stonewall Rebellion was actually a moment when that argument was rejected. And our historical memory tends to erase that, you know, in our minds. We kind of think, here's the that there's a continuous a thread from the homophile movement through to 1990s gay rights. And really, there isn't. There are some major disruptions. And so in order to illustrate that, I'm going to read you a few excerpts from Gay Liberation and Radical Lesbian documents. It's really fun if you've never read these things. My students, they really can't believe it when they start actually, the ones who haven't been exposed to these before. I want to read them. You know, organizations with names like the Gay Liberation Front, Dyke Tactics, Third World Revolution, the Combahee River Statement, Radical Lesbian Star, the Street Transsexual Action Revolutionaries, lots of these very transient organizations. I'm going to argue that they did three things, and then I'll read and you can see whether you think it holds up. One is that they expanded that collective notion of we beyond the we of the homophile minority. They expanded the conception of the world in which we must act. And they also expanded notions of participatory democracy and social movement through which we must act at this particular moment. So the first thing is from Alan Young. This is Out of the Closets, which was published in 1972, Voices of Gay Liberation. It was been reprinted a couple of times. And this is from Alan Young's Out of the Closets and Into the Streets. Gay in the most far-reaching sense means not homosexual, but sexually free. This includes a long-range vision of sensuality as a basis for sexual relationships. This sexual freedom is not some kind of groovy lifestyle with lots of sex, doing what feels good irrespective of others. It is a sexual freedom premised upon the notion of pleasure through equality. No pleasure where there is inequality. Gay is good for all of us. The artificial categories, heterosexual and homosexual, have been laid on us by a sexist society. Children are born sexual. To protect the power of straight men in a sexist society, homosexuality becomes prohibited behavior. In a free society, everyone will be gay. It may be utopian to think that all people who now define themselves as straight will become gay, but it's not utopian to ask people who call themselves revolutionaries to struggle against sexism by working toward establishing a gay identity. The next one is from Martha Shelley, and it's called Gay is Good. We are the extrusions of your unconscious mind, your worst fears made flesh. From the beautiful boys at Cherry Grove to the aging queens in the uptown bars, the taxi-driving dykes to the lesbian fashion models, the hookers male and female on 42nd Street, the leather lovers, and the very ordinary, very unlurid gays, we are the sort of people everyone was taught to despise. And now we are shaking off the chains of self-hatred and marching on your citadels of repression. You have managed to drive your own homosexuality down under the skin of your mind and to drive us down and out into the gutter of self-contempt. The next is from the Gay Revolutionary Party Manifesto. Gay revolution will not lead to freedom of association for gay people in a predominantly straight world, nor will it lead to straight-defined homosexuality with marriages and exclusive monogamy. Gay revolution will produce a world in which all social and sensual relationships will be gay, and which homo and heterosexuality will be incomprehensible terms. Convergence at the point of gay feminist consciousness by people from the gay and women's movements will be the initial stage of this revolution. And then last is from the Third World Gay Revolution. These are all between 1970 and 1972. We want the right of self-determination over the use of our bodies, the right to be gay anytime, any place, the right to free physiological change and modification on demand, the right to free dress and adornment. We want the abolition of the institution of the bourgeois nuclear family. We want a free non-compulsory education system. We want all third world gay men to be exempt from compulsory military service. We want guaranteed full employment. We want a new society. Now, I'm not reading these because I think that these are all great or workable ideas. I'm reading these even though much of it is clearly fantasy, has no hope of having any strategic grounding, is like not the terms or the politics we would return to in the present. So it's not nostalgia like this is what I wish we could become again, because a lot of this is really completely unworkable, unthinkable in the present. But I'm reading, and I have a few more to read. I'm reading it because it does take a kind of can opener to the way of thinking about what is at stake in the regulation of gender and sexuality, and what our political aspirations, how our political aspirations might be framed. The next few are from this lovely book, Smash the Church, Smash the State. And the first one is from the New York Gay Liberation Front's Statement of Purpose. We are a revolutionary group of men and women formed with the realization that complete sexual liberation for all people cannot come about unless existing social institutions are abolished. We reject today's attempt to impose sexual roles and definitions of our nature. The GLF Boston, its first action was to send a contingent to the 1970 moratorium on Boston Common against the Vietnam War, bringing signs that said, "Bring the boys home, GLF." The second action was a dance. So, Dyke Tactics, founded in Philadelphia and very active in the mid-'70s, there's an essay in here by Paula Boschetta, who's now a women's studies professor at Berkeley, talking about her life in the Dyke Tactics Collective in the mid-'70s. Most of us were born in the U.S., but some were immigrants. Our age spanned from the teens to the late 20s. Most of us worked together at Alexandria Books, the city's feminist and lesbian bookstore. A few of us were students. A few of us were unemployed. Together we committed to lesbian struggles. Most of us had come from and remained within other movements for national liberation, black liberation, civil rights, anarchist, and socialist movements. As a group, we saw our liberation as inseparably encompassing struggles against lesbophobia, sexism, racism, poverty, capitalism, and the destruction of the environment. I think this gives you a sense of the kind of breaking open that happened post-Stonewall, and the way that, though it's rhetorically overheated and almost entirely without a strategy, these kind of and sometimes with a breathtaking sense of entitlement as well, with a kind of politics that we really can't go back to, it does sort of offer us a sense of the possibility of opening our political vision up and not running a straight line from the homophile movement to the present. The second one that I wanted to look at is the AIDS epidemic and the politics of ACT UP. And also just say, by comparison, since more of you will be familiar with ACT UP politics and demonstrations, the things that happened in the course of the mobilization against HIV. One was the expansion of the category gay men to men who have sex with men. Once it was determined that the category gay really was not going to capture all of the people, all of the men who had sex with men, and that there was a need to come up with ways of formulating across race and class differences and regional and urban and rural differences a way of thinking about who needed this help, and that the category gay turned out to be too small, too contained to reach across those lines. It was also a moment of a flash of an expanded world and seeing that the intersections of government and industry, the way the FDA related to big pharma, that those were things that we needed to understand in order to intervene, in order to act effectively around issues of gender and sexuality within the context of the AIDS epidemic. Ultimately, some AIDS activists went on to establish a global frame and argue that it was racial and gender inequalities worldwide that really produced the ground for the spread of this kind of epidemic. And this sort of, that argument tracks with, on the previous panel, the notion of a sendemic, the way that many forms of inequality and marginalization work together and then produce sickness. That's something that, global AIDS activists have seen. There were also all kinds of experiments with participatory democracy, exchanges between artists, writers, academics and cultural theorists and activist projects, a lot of cross-fertilization across those lines that produced moments of sort of flash of creativity. Again, I don't mean to romanticize or produce a sense of nostalgia about it, because those were a kind of transient moment. There were a lot of infighting, and anyone who had any experience in any of the ACT UPs know what the limits and problems in that political moment were. The ways in which we can't or wouldn't want to go back. But what happened in the 1970s and 90s during this era of post-Stonewall and ACT UP politics, the counterattack against social movements in general and against the generosities, the redistributions of the welfare state really gained force. And that global and national institutions mobilized a political campaigns that were designed to cut back on the gains of social movements and their calls for redistributions, and also to roll back the gains of social movements, to shrink the social services of the state by making appeals to cut taxes, and to expand the free market, the so-called free market globally, to produce greater profits, but also the result of that, 20 years of what's been called neoliberal policy, shrinking the limited welfare states and eliminating state services, privatizing social services, privatizing garbage collection charge, privatizing prisons, going into Iraq and privatizing that economy. The result of that has been a redistribution of resources upward that has produced a kind of stark worldwide inequality that's greater than anything since the Gilded Age. In fact, some argue that it's the greatest inequality in the history of the planet. So I'm not going to analyze that, but just use it as a kind of background, that the attacks on social services, the shrinking of social services, and the deregulation of economic activity and the privatization of industry is a background that I want to use to talk about the gender and sexual politics that emerged in this period, the same time as these politics I was just outlining, called family values politics, which was not just an alliance of social conservatives and free marketeers, but what the project of family values promoters was in part the idealization of the family, which is tied to the shrinking welfare state as social services are privatized, because it's that family, the private household, that needs to take up the services that are being cut back in terms of the state. So in terms of taking care of children, taking care of elderly, taking care of disabled people and the sick, as the state does less and less of that and pulls back on the limited extent to which that was done, as people lose their benefits in their jobs, as the wages are depressed in various places, as pensions are threatened, as it's not so clear Social Security is so stable, as health insurance prices go up, and the basic environment of insecurity grows over a period of 30 years, the private household becomes the place where people look for security. And what people look for security there is it's idealized by the marriage movement and by family values activists, as in part as something that goes along with the overall privatization of the economy, because what the private household becomes is the place where social services, caretaking of dependents, is privatized. So that it's women who are unpaid or who are low paid do the work of caretaking in the home more and more as other kinds of supports contract. So they build at the same time. The idealization of the family, as in fact the divorce rate goes up and the structure of the family changes, the idealization of marriage and the family goes up. At the same time that basic insecurity also rises, and people fall back on the importance of kinship networks and private households as the place they will go if they need social or material support. It becomes more and more important, and the idea that there's any kind of threat then to the household and to that security becomes an incredible flashpoint. So that when conservatives start to use gay marriage as a threat, as the idea of a threat, they went out and did focus groups in order to test messages on all, when they were running in all of these elections with the state-level domas. And they found that when they ran explicitly anti-gay messages, that they lost. So they retooled their messages to say things like, the traditional family is under threat. Marriage is not secure. There's an attack on our families. And that generated anxiety and support. But it's not strictly homophobia. Homophobia is, of course, a large. I'm not really happy with the term homophobia, but antagonism to LGBT and queer people is a central part of that. But it also depends quite centrally on the insecurity that leads people to want to depend on a secure household and an idealized family as the place to go when everything else is drying up. So it's at this time then also that welfare reform, the cutting back of social supports for women unemployed and poor women with children, it gets paired with the promotion of marriage, because marriage is promoted as the site where women will get off the dole. Women and their children will get off the public purse and get off the dole and through marriage, and that will save the state money. So we'll spend money on promoting marriage. There was billions of dollars put into marriage reform legislation to promote marriage to poor women with children as a way of having women be able to share higher male wages and benefits and then do this caretaking labor in a private setting. So it was actually explicit in those welfare reform bills that cut back on support that marriage would be the program that could replace those social supports. Same-sex marriage falls into this environment in this really schizophrenic way, because on the one hand, it's represented as the absolute antithesis of this stable family and the threat to that stable family. But on the other hand, and even some conservatives support gay marriage because of its the way that it will help to produce a kind of stability and order. And sometimes the same-sex marriage campaign, sometimes it echoes the rhetoric of the marriage movement in idealizing marriage as the site for care and responsibility. And other times another kind of framing is placed on it. And this is where I really very much agree with something Shannon said last night during the Q&A. And that Shannon said that really the direction of the same-sex, the implications of it, whether it's progressive or whether it's conservative in its effects, is going to depend on how we're going to frame it, on how it's framed, on its meaning, what it comes with, how it's argued. And I'll return to that in a minute. But I also wanted to say that the other thing that's happening, aside from this backlash politics and the neoliberal downsizing of social services, the other thing that's happening during this period since the election of Ronald Reagan and a more conservative national politics is also 20 years worth of the professionalization of LGBT politics at the level of national organizations, where what we have in place that was put in place during those years are mostly lobbying and litigation organizations and some membership, like NGLTF. But the experiments with participatory democracy that came out of post-Stonewall, or that were tried through ACT UP, have become really only very localized. So that mostly you have decisions that are made by national organizations to pursue an agenda where there's no mechanism for consultation, where there's no mechanism for accountability, where the decision-making takes place in a structure where there's a board of directors, there's fundraising, there's some contact with members or constituents who send money, but there are no democratic decision-making structures surrounding those kinds of organizations. And even the ones that are membership organizations, like NGLTF, there's a very big difference between being a volunteer, a staff person, or a member, and being being mobilized in a social movement and being an activist. So this, this change over this time is, not the fault of the people who are working hard in these organizations to make the best decisions they can and forward an agenda that they have worked out in consultation with constituents. It's a matter of the social and cultural and historical environment that has demobilized a social movement and thrown up a kind of professionalized set of organizations and produced a kind of politics that has very little of the kind of mass mobilization, creative, energetic, spirited presence, democratic debate, creative utopian imaginings, forms of accountability, that instead has kind of professionalized decision-making. And this is the set of organizations that in the mid-90s began to frame marriage as one of the priorities of these organizations. The organizations standing in for a movement and setting up, although they didn't do this on their own, they were actually pressured by private lawsuits. So, because I think as long as same-sex couples are excluded from any, or same-sex or gay LGBT queer individuals are excluded from any status or institution, there will be and there should be pushback against that exclusion. But when the organizations, and that they haven't always done this, so this is very uneven. There have been very different framings from different places. But when we idealize marriage and frame it as a core institution that is necessary for full human dignity and citizenship, we usually unwittingly contribute to, in the first place, the stigmatization and marginalization of unmarried people, who, when gay, are seen as represented as selfish and hypersexual, when women of color treated as irresponsibly reproductive. But the argument about the centrality of marriage and notions of citizenship, depending on the framing of it, can contribute to that kind of further marginalization of the unmarried. And it can also, usually unwittingly, entrench the ideological function of marriage in the current political and economic climate, where it's seen as the proper place for the provision of private caretaking in the absence of adequate incomes, benefits, and services for many dependent populations. And when we do this, we also obscure, when we argue for the dignity and full citizenship of marriage as a democratic a form of democratic recognition and individual right, we obscure the extent to which marriage remains a regulatory institution, where it's deeply embedded within the particular political economic moment, as marriage right now serves a different set of economic and political interests than it did 20 years ago, and then it did 100 years before that. So the question is now, if you take the big view, what is the function that marriage, not just same-sex marriage, but marriage plays in the political economy? And one answer to that question is as a site for the privatization of social services, among other things. And we can't see that. We can't see that unless we look at welfare reform and the promotion of marriage there alongside a same-sex marriage exclusion, and if we look at that within a larger history of the regulation that come with the institution of marriage. We don't see it when we're focusing on claiming a right that people are excluded from exercising. And, you know, there's no way not to. I mean, there's no way to not argue against the exclusion of anyone from a public institution of any kind. But when we just do that, we perhaps don't see that our rhetoric is doing some political and economic work that we may not see it doing. And we need this bigger frame. We need to see marriage politics in its total framework for the labor that it does, and the way that people who are unmarried, because in order to be inside, there has to be an outside, and the question is, who is on the outside and why? And there is a distribution that goes along with that. Now, you know, there's some numbers on the Williams Institute website that are very interesting. And you know, nobody has really looked terribly carefully at them. But they do show that the population, the LGB, they didn't do T, and it's odd that they did B because it throws their numbers off really in a really funny way, is that it's only about a quarter of the population that's in stable couples. And those are disproportionately prosperous white men. And that the black lesbians are the most likely to be unpartnered, and they're the most likely to be responsible for children. And, you know, I'm not claiming validity for these numbers because it's very hard to count. It's extremely hard to count this population. And throwing the B's in there really does throw it off because they're counting same-sex couples when they've got an LGBT population, not doing anything about T's. But it does indicate that there are a distribution of a differential distribution of the need or desire for marriage as a priority issue in meeting the needs of this larger defined constituency. But I'm running out of time, so I just want to conclude in saying what my ideas are about the implications of all of this for now. And one is that I think that we need to broaden our agenda and advocate the democratization and diversification of forms of household and partnership recognition and benefits at the same time that the exclusion from marriage is argued for. Not later, like not after the revolution, not later, but at the same time. And if it is argued that there should be no exclusions from the institution of marriage, but we need a broader range of forms of household recognition and benefit provision, many benefits should be universalized and not offered through marriage, that if we do that, then we have a better chance of producing a kind of larger benefit and effect, and less of a chance of playing into the ideological function of marriage as a kind of privatization site for a certain kind of, and the location for a certain kind of privilege. That we need to generate a more expansive a form of queer politics that doesn't just focus on issues that affect only queer people, but on issues that affect most queer people. And that's really, that would give you, you know, looking at things like unemployment and retirement and childcare and things that affect most queer people, but rather than the things that affect only queer people, which is what our organizations tend to define gay issues as the ones that only, rather than the ones that define most. So looking beyond legal remedies for harms inflicted by violence and discrimination, and looking beyond education around those as well, as important as they are, we need to embed them in this broader vision of how our whole political economy works and how we might reorder the way we live together for forms of more expansive forms of economic and racial, gender, and sexual justice. That's it. And overtime.
Take questions like this. We will take questions. You want to follow me?
So we invite your questions, and Lisa Dugan is graciously willing to take them.
You can also denounce, or, you know, rant, or, yeah. Bonnie, right?
Yeah. Oh, I can't believe you remembered me. I'm so flattered. I'm getting flustered now. This is a really loud microphone. So Stonewall resonates for me. The Stonewall theory resonates for me on a number of levels. Being a queer person, being what I would characterize as a not gay person, and being a radical militant. And so I'm wondering to what extent you think militancy is accommodated for in current political, current participatory climates. And if you think, and if you wanted to speak to Utah specifically, that would be interesting.
You know, I wrote about queer politics in Utah, as Catherine mentioned in the introduction, and where I think there's some incredibly creative politics and thinking going on. And I've been keeping up, you know, with what's going on since I wrote that article. And I know that there have been just, you know, lots of disputes around the deal that was made with the legislature to, if they don't do their bad stuff, then we won't do our stuff for a while. And other people had different ideas about how to proceed. And I think the thing that was really fabulous is that there was a town hall meeting came out of that, right? Like a place where everybody came to argue out the differences in opinion and strategy and conception. And because some people think, well, you know, they should just do their worst. Because if you let them do their worst and pass all this bad stuff, they're so far to the right, actually, of public opinion even in Utah at this point, that it will hurt them politically and it will give us a chance to generate outrage. And, you know, so there are very many, and then the strategic, so there are many different strategic possibilities. And it was really interesting to me and unusual, and one of the great things about Utah, that about politics in Salt Lake City, I'll say specifically, queer politics in Salt Lake City, let me be really clear about that these things, that there are places created to hash that out. And to hash that out across lines where usually there's just sort of spitting from your different corner, right? You know, in New York, the Queers for Economic Justice will issue another press release denouncing the way that the Matthew Shepard hate crime bill just gives money to law enforcement. And then it'll be totally ignored. And then, you know, I mean, it's like they're just like, there'll be like little, but no, there's never any conversation. There's never any engagement. Another thing I greatly appreciated about Shannon's talk last night was the invitation to talk across these kinds of differences of opinion. And to create, you know, moments for energy and exciting and imagining new ways of organizing and thinking. And I do think, you know, that Salt Lake City does that more at this moment in the past few years than most places. And that partly came, I think, starting at the outrage after Proposition 8. The big march at the Temple seemed to generate just a tremendous amount of energy because, you know, mass mobilizations like that create excitement and make new things possible. And that certainly did happen here post-Prop 8. I don't know that that answered your question, but yeah, Troy.
Thanks. I want you to go a little bit deeper into this fantasy utopia that you're talking about, and imagining possibilities of expansion of different kinds of institutions and different kinds of rights beyond marriage. Give us some concrete ideas of what that might look like.
Are you talking specifically about the household partnership recognition
thing?
Exactly.
I've heard you talk about, you know, because often people will say, well, we've got civil unions and we have marriage and that's separate but not equal. But I've heard you argue in many places that you want both and more.
Well,
what does that really practically look like?
There's a statement on the web it's www.beyondmarriage.org. And it was signed by several hundred queer writers, academics, artists, activists, actually calling for a framing of saying that what queer should be asking for are universal benefits rather than benefits through partnerships, but also for then ways of recognizing the ways that we actually live. For instance, you might co-parent with your ex, but your current lover is your medical next of kin. But you may then share property and want to file joint taxes with 2 people that you live together in a house. You might want to, that unit of the marriage, the way that marriage creates a single unit of, where economic joint enterprise, sexual partnership, reproduction, and the way that those are all tied together, that actually doesn't describe the way most of us live our lives at this point. Most of us have these things kind of split off in different ways, and we don't live that institution. But our laws produce that institution or incentivize it because of its political and economic fit. So rather than arguing only for inclusion in this institution that doesn't fit and that allocates privileges based on marriage that other people are excluded from, to argue for the broadest distribution possible of recognitions in a wide variety in a menu that offers different possibilities. At the same time that one argues that no one should be excluded from marriage, right? I mean, it's not possible not to also argue that. But if you frame it as both and, it's wrong to exclude same-sex couples from marriage, but we also need this wider array of benefits and recognitions. Healthcare shouldn't be allocated through partnership and employment. Healthcare should be, that's like the lesbian and gay organizations did not create a constituency for universal healthcare. Right? They're a constituency for marriage and domestic partnership as a way to get health care, to privatize the distribution of health care that way, rather than saying we want universal benefits. Well, so then the constituencies, the possible constituencies for universal health care got split off in just those ways. Imagining, calling for these universal health care at the same time that one calls for multiple forms of recognition has a better chance of including all of us in the recognitions and benefits that we need and that should be distributed equally than just demanding marriage, one size fits all marriage, which actually doesn't fit that many, and then saying, well, after we've done that, then we'll go fix these other things. It'll be more possible. Well, it might be more possible, and it might be less possible. After marriage was passed in Massachusetts, they did away with domestic partnership in a lot of corporations in the university, because now you don't need domestic partnership. You can be married. So you can lose options that actually people preferred to marriage, the lower level of integration that option was lost and replaced by one size fits all. So that's kind of a roll. It's a victory, but it's a rollback at the same time. So how can we have victories and act against rollbacks, like the loss of the plural statuses we already had, because marriage starts to substitute for them?
Hi.
Yeah? Who has the I?
Get the microphone, Steph. There.
Does someone have the microphone?
In your accounting of the relations, the kinds of relations you would see in a utopia or an imagined utopia, my head started screaming, ego discord. Ego discord. I mean, I don't know very many people who are really psychologically, emotionally capable of that range of relationship.
Well, there's someone, a colleague of mine, a friend of mine named Terry Bogus, who runs the Center Kids program at the Lesbian and Gay Community Center in New York City. And so she sees all kinds of families, right? All kinds who come in for services for their kids. And she reads out this incredible list of the way people actually live, right? So she has this long list of well, there's Susan, who's co-parenting with her ex's brother, and also whose current lover lives with, that ex, but she lives in a house with someone who's her ex, and she's not making that up as a utopian, scheme for intimacy. Though, queer politics, one of its tremendous promises is to reimagine the possibilities for intimacy. Not that everybody needs to, go for the most sort of, unusual version, but one of its great possibilities was imagining new ways to be intimate.
Yes, I believe in those ways. I just wonder how we get there.
And the ways that people actually live now. I mean, that's Terry's point, is that if you just describe and this is straight people too, right? The way they actually live and compared to what's presented as the public, in other words, Bill Clinton's actual life, or as opposed to, if you look at the actual lives of people, they're very complex. And they don't fit, at least not for, even if they do fit it, they don't fit it for very long. The sort of model of lifetime monogamy in a unit that combines economics, sexuality, and reproduction, that's really just not descriptive in the present. Not only that it's possible to get beyond it in the future, but it really doesn't describe us in the present. Though our legal system operates as though it did describe us. And our legal strategies in the LGBT organizations are asking to be included in that without pointing out that maybe we could do something to that to make it more democratic, more diverse. Some do point it out, by the way. There's a tremendous range of opinion, and people make arguments for marriage equality in sometimes incredibly conservative terms and sometimes in incredibly progressive terms. Although the pressure of courtrooms and political campaigns is to frame them more conservatively. So even someone whose own politics is like, let's diversify, when they have to win a political campaign or a courtroom argument, if there's a pressure to produce a certain kind of melodramatic, sympathetic, we're victims, please save us, let us have rights like everybody else, that's the only narrative that courtrooms and politics tend to accept. But that's, when then our only main organizations are lobbying and litigation organizations, that narrative becomes the only narrative. I think that using that narrative in some settings is almost inescapable, especially court cases. But when that's the only narrative, and there's not a broader democratic movement culture producing and arguing and saying, wait a minute, then the push becomes conservatizing rather than producing new possibilities, new progressive possibilities. So it's all, like Shannon said, in the framing. And then dealing with the institutional basis from which we launch our politics and make our claims, and the way that influences what we can and can't say. We have to pay attention to the institutional matrix, to the political economy, and to the broader cultural effects of the rhetoric that we end up using.
I want to thank you for coming here. You're unbelievable.
Hi, I wanted to, thanks a lot for coming. It's really a great lecture. I wanted to ask about the political and economic geography that you discussed in this speech, and kind of actually I was interested in a connection with some of Lisa Diamond's recent research about sexual fluidity in women versus sort of more of a sort of sexual rigidity in men. I'm not quite sure because it's sort of a hypothesis, I guess, at the moment. But I was wondering sort of how you see that geography influencing those different kind of sexualities within gender.
Oh my. Catherine, would you like to answer that question?
Well, I don't know why I'm obeying that wish. Well, I'm just going to say that, others can chime in, but first of all, we are just never going to know about masculine sexual fluidity until the stigma is lessened. We have no idea, right? Maybe there's something biological. I tend not to think so, but it could be. But in other words, we're not yet at the point, it seems to me, to be able to answer that question, given sort of differential stigmas that attach. But I think your point, about differential, domestic labor, all these kinds of gender differences, produce this sort of pressure on marriage, because marriage is a differential kind of arrangement for men and women. Not necessarily lesbians and gay men, but in many ways you'd have to say that too. So unless you can sort of take all these different factors into account, this goes back to Lisa's point about the one size fits all. There we're back to that kind of intellectual incoherence that's showing up in the conversations in many different ways for gay advocates and for people fighting on the other side. That's, I think, what we have to fight. I think the one interesting thing that's happened in terms of marriage as well is the way in which the conservatives have put so-called homosexuality now at the center of the definition of marriage. So if you're a true sort of believer in some version of deconstruction, as we both are as queer theorists, I mean, it's fascinating the way in which the definition one man and one woman just screams gay. That's a pretty interesting development, it seems to me, in terms of marriage stuff. You don't have to agree with that.
I agree with every single thing you say. Yeah, I mean, I hope it was clear in what I was saying that the opposition to same-sex marriage and this is partly a support for the gendered labor arrangements of traditional marriage. It's support for the kind of unpaid work that married women do in the private household. It's support for the second shift, which was absorbing a lot of this caretaking labor. And so what's the threat of same-sex marriage? It doesn't participate in that labor system. But the conservative support for same-sex marriage, say someone like David Brooks, who argues for same-sex marriage, those are folks who really believe that the predominant political and economic arrangements no longer depend on a gender division of labor. So they think lesbian and gay marriage is good because it produces this kind of public order. It's conservatizing on lesbian and gay people, and we don't really need this kind of gendered labor regime anymore. So it's the difference. The debate between conservatives is in part about whether this gendered labor regime is really necessary to the political economic interests. And also your question about masculinity, the Kinsey report, which came out in 1948 about men, that showed really a huge percentage of men having same-sex sex. And it came out at the same time that the homophile movement is arguing for this kind of sexual minority. And that tension has kind of always been there, right? Eve Sedgwick calls it the universalizing versus the minoritizing notion of thinking about sexual difference. But, I agree with Catherine, of course, that we don't know. We don't know what kind of sex straight men are actually having.
First of all, I think you two could tag team a lecture sometime. Fantasy alone. But the first thing I want to say also is that I think that one of the most powerful elements of your argument is this notion of the existing diversity of families. And if there was some way to describe or represent that, graphically perhaps, you could probably convince a lot more people who grew up like I did in communities where stable, heterosexual, married families were the norm. So it's difficult, I think, for a lot of people to imagine their own lives a diverse kind of relationship. That's not really necessary. It's for them to be able to support that. But my question really is, you talked a little bit about the trend of privatization and neoliberalism, which I actually agree with. I wonder if your opinion is on the corporatization of the gay movement and how the corporate element and the sort of the wealthy gay elite echelon has sort of been controlling the movement and putting forward the notion of marriage as the sort of ultimate goal when the benefits for, as you're saying, most queer people are being forgotten.
Okay, so as to the first part of what you said, the demographics, all you have to do is read the census. And that will tell you that the two-parent with children home is a minority of the U.S. population, and it is also a form that people spend larger and larger years of their life not living in. So that is a demographic reality. So we have a kind of fantasy that our legal system imposes of how people live, but all you have to do is read the census, any census, and it displaces the notion that this is actually the statistical norm. It is not. So the second part of your question, you know, I don't think it's like there's a conspiracy, right? That the gay organizations are like just catering to the rich or owned by the corporations. I don't believe that at all. What I think is there are these structural forces. In order to qualify for a 501c3 status, right, which is a tax-exempt status, you have to have a certain kind of nonprofit corporate form. And that nonprofit corporate form produces a board of directors, an executive director, it produces a staff, it produces a board, it produces a certain kind of fundraising, and once that is in place, then the mode of decision making and the incentives are structured by that form. So that even radical organizations, if you take Audre Lorde Project or Queers for Economic Justice, they're 501c3s. And the pressure on those organizations, you know, to get tax-exempt status, you need to have this form, is to fundraise, since wealthy gays and certain kinds of foundations are less likely to give money in the first place to those organizations. The pressure is to become service providers, right? The way they get their money then is to become service providers. So as badly needed as those services are, that is a privatization of those services, and it does turn the focus of those organizations away from organizing, from political work, from thinking and stirring up trouble, to providing services to people in homeless shelters and things like that. So there's structural forces, and not a conspiracy to sell out to corporations, but it does turn out that, well, if you want to raise enough money to do your project, you have to fit the parameters of this fundraising protocol. And the only thing that I think might rise to the level of a conspiracy, because now I can't remember the name of it, but there's a meeting once a year between the big funders who fund gay stuff and the heads of the major gay organizations. This past year, I think it was in Las Vegas. It's private, it's secret, no journalists are allowed, and people have to sign a form saying they won't say what happens in it. Okay, you want to tell me this is a democratic social movement where the rich people and the leaders get together and they don't allow reporters? We wouldn't let them get away with that in Congress. But that is so that I think rises to the level of conspiracy. That there are no journalists allowed, and people are not even allowed to report out, you know, what happened. They have to sign. They won't blog about it. They won't, you know, when they go. Then the agenda is set. What will be funded? What will be the priority issues? You know, it's an understatement to say there's no democratic discussion around that then. So there's no ability to challenge. So you end up getting things like, you know, after the Prop 8 disaster in California, there was a lot of really unfortunate kind of name-calling, denunciation, and like, you did this wrong, and you sold out, and you did, you know, that, and defense, like we did as best we could. We were trying to make decisions. It's not, you know, if we had won, you wouldn't be saying this. I think that kind of personalized fighting happens in the absence of any mechanism of accountability. Because there's no mechanism of accountability. There's no way for people to register how they think the priorities should have been set, how the campaign should have been run, there's no way to do that. It's made, the decisions are made by groups of, you know, leaders and organizations that it's not their intention to be undemocratic or unaccountable, but that's the structure of those organizations. They are. So there's no way. So then what happens is there's a huge fight afterwards, and it gets sort of, you know, personalized infighting instead of there being any mechanism of accountability. So, you know, and that's not a conspiracy, right? It's just a moment of like, well, how do we deal with this? How do we have a community debate instead of a name-calling fest? And I think that's another case in which I'll point to the beauty and perfection of Salt Lake City, is that you all had the start of that here, right? Like right after the decision was made by Equality Utah to make this deal with the legislature, for a few minutes it looked like it was going to be a big fight which was going to feature calling people names or, you know, calling people out personally. But that got deflected into a town hall meeting, right? Which, you know, California is too big to have a town hall meeting. But that was like an incredibly sane, creative, productive move to take that turn, rather than continue sort of fighting it out in op-eds where people were denounced for the decisions. Instead, to have people explain the decisions that they made and actually hear complaints and disaffection and other ideas.
So thank you, Lisa, for this talk. It's so provocative and full of ideas. I want to bring us back to an exchange between Shannon and Catherine after last night's talk, where Catherine, you said, I want the right to marry so that I can
not do it.
Not marry. That is, to reject this choice and to make that choice that I've made legible, right? And that struck me as a queer argument for the right to marry in both senses. Right? And I liked it. And I wanted to just say, we don't say that we shouldn't deny this right because marriage is sacred and perfect, but that we shouldn't deny this right because it's a choice that we should have, to defend it as a choice. And I was just curious, first just to invite you to sort of, what does one think of that in light of all the critiques of the concept of choice, both from feminist and queer perspectives? And then, and it's related, I just want to invite you, you've talked a lot about the privatization of social services, and to just expound on that phrase, and particularly the words privatization and social, and what is meant by that, because after all, marriage in some sense is a government subsidy, a profound, and in the US more than any other Western nation, a profound subsidy of the child care going on there. And the problem, I think, is not that it's, well, or one could argue the problem is not that it's private, but that it's not plural. That there are not enough forms of this form of subsidy.
Well, it's not. I mean, it's not much of a subsidy for childcare, given the cost and the labor that go into childcare. Getting yourself a little tax break isn't really going to help that much. But your larger point. So the first one was about the language of choice, right? I don't think it's and Catherine doesn't either think that I'm speaking to you.
You know what I say about that.
Yeah, it's not a matter of well, we should have this right and everybody can individually choose to be in it or choose not to be in it. It's because, who we are is shaped by the choices that are culturally made available to us. And we don't individually control the nature of the choices that we have. Collectively, and usually, and in this hierarchical way in the U.S. right now, the choices that are offered to us are loaded. You can choose to work for minimum wage, or you can choose to starve. It's your choice. Well, so in marriage isn't that kind of stark choice, but it's like if your choice is to participate in an institution through which all of these benefits are channeled, and which legitimates and produces respectability, or you can choose not to participate, in which case, you can choose to be marginalized or, seen as selfish or seen as reproductively irresponsible and then, socially punished. That's really not a choice. So the question is, how do we produce an array of possibilities that are supportive of a range of different ways of living, without judging those different ways, with state neutrality, right, on the nature of those choices. And I don't believe in state neutrality, but in this case, I'm saying that that the idea is to produce possibilities beyond that you're in this institution or you're out of it, and you take the consequences of being out of it. Would you like to say what you would say?
Yeah, I mean, just obviously the piece I left out last night is that things look like, the more privilege you have, the more it looks like choice. I have a lot of privilege for being a white bourgeois professor with a partner who has a good job, so I can refuse marriage. I've got lots of friends who have some resources who cannot afford to make that choice. A friend of ours who's an anarchist, started out as sort of lesbian anarchist, ended up falling in love with a man, getting married because she needed to fund a hip operation that she would not be able to fund in any other way, which is a very debilitating circumstance she'd had from a car crash. I completely understand that non-choice choice. So, as usual, Dugan just can speak for me anytime she likes.
Now, the second part of your question was about...
So it's about privatization. As to say,
privatization.
I mean, you said it in this offhand way. I don't believe in state neutrality. And I would imagine there's a lot of things about government that you don't. The idea that if only government were managing social services, this would
Right? No. That I don't want to get us into territory that's going to go too far afield. But let me just say this: the framework that I'm using, which I really didn't spell out much at all, was like after the Depression of the 30s, one of the responses to the Depression was the New Deal. And to try to use Keynesian economic policies to spend government money and to redistribute some resources from corporate wealth and individual wealth into the provision of unemployment insurance, Social Security, eventually Medicare, eventually Medicaid, the Great Society, like to spend some money to try to stabilize and provide for people is very limited, and had racial and gender exclusions. People who were domestic workers or farm workers were left out of it. I mean, there are lots of things to bat. And in the United States, it was much more limited than it was in Europe. But there was a limited amount of redistribution and provision of services for people. But starting in the 1970s, and the genealogy goes back to the 40s. But the Business Roundtable and others organized to try to kill the welfare state. Right? And by the strategy to kill the welfare state is still working, and that is to argue against taxes. And so if you cut taxes, Paul Krugman had a beautiful column about this a couple of days ago. If you cut taxes, you create a fiscal crisis of the state. The state won't have enough money. So it'll have to cut its expenditures. And when that happens, I mean, the money that would have gone into taxes, that would have gone into Medicare and Social Security, where is it going instead? It's going into corporate profits. It's going into Wall Street bankers' pockets. So there are billions. I mean, it's a direct line. The billions in the pockets of Wall Street bankers, even now, is money that, if the taxes were higher, a lot of it would go into, that would then could be distributed, So neoliberalism are all the strategies that have been used to shrink and slam the welfare state. And privatization is a part of that, because it takes these services that were provided by government, like prisons, and call that a service, and garbage collection, and to try to have corporations do them, and that way corporations can make money and private profits on them, and it's harder to unionize, and so neoliberalism has been eroding the welfare. But when I said, I wouldn't advocate just going back to the welfare state. I want to do a little more than that. I am a commie people queer, but a little better than the welfare state we can do. But the political rhetorical environment is still a kind of anti-tax, anti-spending, and that is the primary rhetorical strategy of neoliberalism. But the other one is family values and support for marriage. And so, when gay people join the marriage idealization campaign as a progressive equality movement, we also are contributing to this strategy, and it becomes a support for a neoliberal strategy. It's not intended, but it is, right? Here's marriage. It's the good thing we all want, right? And we want that. We're not arguing for universal health care. We're arguing for marriage. And that produces a kind of narrow inequality and a conservatizing function that is damaged. It's true that, the state provides subsidies, for some subsidies through the tax structure and all of that, and it's a longer discussion about the investment in the reproductive household, investment in private social reproduction versus investment in public social reproduction. So, the equation has been shifted away from public to private. It never was very far in the public to begin with, but now it's more in the private. Does this make sense to people? Because it's a bigger, longer thing, and so some of you are probably totally familiar with it, and others are saying, what? Neo what? So I just hope it's sort of, I mean, you should recognize this, right, as what's been happening politically. People are arguing to cut taxes. They want to privatize Social Security. They want to downgrade Medicare. They want to, the Republicans right now both want to keep the big tax cut, you know, and you know, so make it impossible, and thereby make it impossible to do national health care, to do any kind of even serious, not so national health care. So that's the overall environment. It's a global environment, not just the U.S. And our politics as LGBT people exists in that environment. And we need to understand it, and we need to take responsibility for the political work that our rhetoric does in a larger political economy.
I will say, too, if you want to know more about neoliberalism, then reading Lisa Duggan's Twilight of Equality will really help you get the background that you need to participate more even in this conversation. If you're having a sense there's a lot more to say about this, there is. And fortunately for you, that means another panel this afternoon. 2:30, Officers Club. Join us. The conversation will continue. Thank you very much for your engaged presence here.